His photos are disturbingly truthful to the particular societies he took them from. And when I first saw his photos, it stood out from all the photographers I've ever researched. Because there's always a backstory of every photograph he took, a recording of the status quo of these people imprinted on a piece of paper. And this is why we decided to make a documentary about this photographer, Alexey Titarenko.
His photos, they show the depth of their souls. You can see the eye sockets in some of his photos, and you can also see their hands move through space and time. It's creepy, yet captivating. Alexey Titarenko was born in 1962 in Leningrad, Soviet Russia. He began taking pictures at the age of 9, and in 1978, he graduated from Leningrad University with a degree in photojournalism. His earlier works, Nomenclature of Signs, was a series that commented on Russia's oppressive communist regime for turning people into mere signs. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, he produced a series of long-exposure photography to document the social conditions in his native city. The result was Titarenko's most famous series of photography, The City of Shadows. In Venice, Havana, and New York, Titarenko perceived strong senses of emotion that radiated from the city's atmosphere, prompting him to document the state of the people through his photography. Lighting. Titarenko employs natural light in the evenings from the sun. In Titarenko's photography, the light source is often dim, implying that the photo is taken on a cloudy, rainy, or snowy day. The bystander view is typical street photography, preserving the authenticity of the image as the subjects are unaware of being photographed. In the case of long exposure, however, the presence of the photographer would cause the people to react, undermining the authenticity of his photograph. This forced Titarenko to seek creative methods to avoid attention, and in extreme cases, pretending to sell his camera, thus convincing people to ignore his presence. Even though the people are the subject of the photo, Titarenko focuses the camera on the background, carving out the background's architectural forms. This was done intentionally to blur the foreground subjects. Along with the utilization of long exposure, people are thus transformed into ghostly figures, absent of personal identity. Titarenko is a master of darkroom techniques. He utilizes solarization, a photographic development process in which the tones of the photo are inverted. That is, the dark areas become light and the light areas become dark. Yet unlike the typical process of solarization, the print is exposed to light during the development process. The subtle employment of this technique not only lowers the contrast, but it also creates a silvery veil around the edges. In addition, Titarenko selectively bleaches and tones his photograph to create a gray-centric effect. Both of these features are distinct in Titarenko's photography. With the use of solarization and long exposure, Titarenko is able to create his most famous photographic series, The City of Shadows. Directly after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a state of political and social instability that transformed its students into wanderers in search of food. Titarenko chose to document the gloomy atmosphere present within the society, hence the use of intense contrast and the lack of moderate tones of gray in this series of photography. With the use of long exposure, Titarenko displays movement in his photo by depicting crowds of people stampeding in the entrance of this train station. He utilizes the contrast between the moderate and dark tones of gray to further accentuate the gloomy atmosphere in the Soviet Union. Titarenko utilizes his background focusing technique, which blurs the foreground, transforming his subjects into ghostly figures. With this technique, he is able to manipulate the scene to look as though all moving things are instead ghosts. Through the utilization of contrast between the subject and the background, the photograph brings the viewer's attention to the pure white dresses. Once again, Titarenko shows movement through long exposure. But instead of showing people's daily lives, he shows us hope, in the contrast of the tones. The hope that the average man can rise to the heights of skyscrapers if he just continues his path at a faster pace. After analyzing Titarenko's techniques and watching interviews, we decided to try it out ourselves. We used his techniques beside the darkroom to create a similar photo.
Now imagine, in the span of 2 minutes, hundreds of thousands of people marching through the same stairs. And this is how Titarenko gets his photos.
Titarenko taught us that, on a literal standpoint, any forms of photography can be applied to any subject matter. Titarenko is a true innovator in street photography, as he introduced long exposure, something that was thought to be impossible and unauthentic, to the field. His experimentation with long exposure is precisely what enabled him to document his views towards the social condition, as well as his success as a photographer. Despite that Titarenko's photography is still a product of constant experimentation, it does not sway from what the photographer intends to represent. This is because Titarenko has a clear vision of the theme and tone of what his photo should incorporate. Mimicking this process of photography would assist photographers to filter out the masterpiece from the constant experimentation.